Joining us now is Paul Heinbecker, a former Canadian ambassador, representative to the United Nations, and an advisor to Prime Minister. Paul, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So we're clearly at an inflection point in a Canada-China relationship with the trials of detained Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor going on in a shroud of secrecy in China this past week. Paul, what does this development mean for the two men, first of all, but more broadly for Canada?
Well, I was going to say, I'm not sure that inflection point is the right word. I think it can get worse. And it obviously could get better. What it means for Canada is that we are being introduced in a very rough way to a new world where the rules of the road are decided by the strongest. We've always said in Canada that we needed a foreign policy that was sort of built on international rules and regulations and agreements and treaties, and that has been the case post-war, especially since 1945, and it's been very successful. But China is starting to play rogue. There was a view that the more we allowed the Chinese into the international trading system, especially, and the other international organizations, the more they would become like us. Well, it turns out that we were wrong. They've gone their own way, and it's a rogue state insofar as Canada is concerned.
Yeah, and I think Rachel, it speaks to the point where how much leverage does Canada really have against a country like China? You know, we've just come off a period where, you know, we had some bumpy times with the United States, and we have a long-standing positive relationship, and we realized how little leverage we had against the U.S. when the president decided to renegotiate the trade. This is China is just another example where, you know, Canadians are learning that there's only so much leverage that we have as a country onto ourselves. And when it comes to China, I don't want to say whether they're in the driver's seat or not, but they have a lot more leverage.
Well, Nick, I looked it up. Population-wise, they're 36 times bigger than we are. Militarily, they're 15 times bigger. And from an active military personnel point of view, they're 33 times bigger than we are.
So Paul, is this why we're seeing...
We're not going to win an argument with those people unless we have some friends, some big friends on our side.
And so that is a perfect lead into my next question, Paul. So is this why we're seeing Canada rely so much on the U.S.? Of course, we've seen diplomats from many nations show up and at least try to get into the trials this week. But over the last number of years, as this has been unfolding, Canada keeps pointing to China. We heard from their foreign secretary this week coming out and once again calling for their detentions to be lifted. So it seems that we are relying on the U.S. Is that an appropriate position for Canada to be in right now?
I don't think it's a question of appropriateness so much as necessity. I mean, the only way we're going to get a proper response out of the Chinese is if we have the backing of the United States and others. The United States indeed sees is putting a lot of emphasis on the importance of alliances and the importance of cooperation with allies. And it's mainly directed at the Chinese. So the United States itself recognizes that even though it's the world's greatest superpower still, that without the support of its allies, it's not going to have the intended effect on the Chinese. So we have to work with other people. We don't have any choice, and we certainly don't have the leverage, as Nick was saying.
And is there more, Nick, we can do? Like, how are you hearing from Canadians that there's an appetite to go further, do more to kind of come at China in a way that Canada possibly could?
Well, we have to bear in mind that we have 2 Canadians being held hostage and a number of other Canadians, a very large number of Canadians living in China. And we're not in a position to sort of dictate terms to the Chinese.
Yeah, but I think, Paul, to add to that point, I agree that that's 100% true. But when we ask Canadians, it's like they're ready to do more. You know, the polling suggests that Canadians are open to trying to advocate for relocating the Olympics out of China. And to your point about sanctions, a pretty strong majority of Canadians Canadians are more likely to want to do economic sanctions in conjunction with the United States, like what you were talking about,
Right.
and solo, which is kind of an understanding of where we're really at.
No, for sure, that's the case. And nobody likes to be pushed around. Nobody likes to be bullied. Everybody wants to stand up to a bully, usually until they get hit in the face. But that's what that's a quote from a boxer. Yes, Canadians are willing to do more, but I don't know whether, and perhaps they're willing to do more, even if it means the economic relationship with China deteriorates significantly. But that will mean jobs, and that'll mean income for a lot of people. So
right.
Whether Canadians are willing to pay the price of their aggressiveness, I'm not so sure.
And I think, Paul, that speaks to the heart of the trickiness and the nuance in this relationship, is that from trade to telecom, our two countries are linked in many ways. And there are other aspects and facets of the relationship beyond what's going on with the Michaels and Meng Wanzhou. And we've seen this week that our ambassador has been recalled. Now, of course, they're saying this happened for high-level special talks that were separate from the ongoing trials. But it seems like we are at an unprecedented moment. We've got Mark Garneau this week coming out quite strong, or at least with new messaging, taking that economic message, like as you said, taking the angle of, hey, other countries, if you want to do business, you've got to know this is the state of play. Your citizens could be arbitrarily detained. Do you think that that's an effective, and is that a significant pivot from the government?
Well, I think it's a necessary one again. I think that it's a very difficult balance that they're trying to strike between being self-respecting on the one hand and not being pushed around, and not creating a situation in which makes circumstances even worse, especially for the two Michaels. There was an opportunity, a year ago or so, to drop this whole procedure, but we missed it, and now we're in a very difficult spot with where we have two Canadian citizens in the situation they're in, and we have no effective way of getting them out.
And so you had mentioned off the top there that the relationship could get worse. What are you forecasting?
I think it's going to get worse. The good news.
How? How much worse could it get?
Oh, it can get a lot worse. There are a lot of economic measures that China, we're a lot more dependent on the Chinese economically than they are on us. And while we have some significant pawns on the board, we aren't in a position to tell and dictate to the Chinese. And if they say, well, that's fine, no more Canadian wheat, no more Canadian minerals, no more Canadian exports, no more Canadian insurance, no more of whatever, they can survive that kind of a contest a lot with a lot less pain than we can. We may be quite willing to fight that. I'm not saying we're not, but we have to be ready for the consequences.
And so, Nick, we saw the steps towards some sanctions this week. Of course, this was tailored towards the officials involved with the genocide going on against the Uyghur Muslim population. Of course, that was a small scale, a handful of people, and I think one corporate organization. I'm wondering if you've heard from Canadians on how have they responded to, A, the fact that the cabinet wasn't going to side with the rest of Parliament and call this a genocide, and B, are they supportive of these kinds of more targeted measures getting at some of the other issues, human rights abuses going on in China?
It's interesting in the polling that we did on this, it suggests that Canadians overall support by a pretty significant margin the motion in the House of Commons calling it a genocide, and they oppose or are disappointed with the fact that the cabinet has abstained. So we should maybe disconnect what might be good foreign policy with what makes for good politics, because it doesn't make for good politics. Heinbecker will probably tell us it makes for good public policy or good foreign policy or better. But what's clear is that Canadians are even open to welcoming individuals who are victims or part of that genocide, welcoming more refugees in the same way that we welcomed Syrian refugees. So there's a lot of appetite for latitude. But the big question, as Paul put his finger on, is like, what is the real economic cost if China really wants to play hardball with Canada? No one knows how big a cost that'll be. And if that kind of gets out there in the public domain, it may make for a very difficult situation for the government and for Canadians.
So having all of this said, Paul, I'm wondering, is there a country that is getting the China relationship right or more right that Canada could be learning lessons from, or even a government past that had challenges with China that was able to stick handle them with more grace?
It's a good question, and I'm not sure that I know the answer. I guess I'd probably say Japan, or maybe South Korea. They may be handling the Chinese better than most others are, but it's not without friction. There's been a lot of trouble between the Chinese and the Japanese. So far, the Japanese have enormous investments in China, and the Chinese need the Japanese technology. So far, they've held it together. But from a Canadian point of view, I think the fundamental reality is that if we could, that we're living in a world which is going to be a lot less cordial to our interests. If the United States succeeds in providing leadership and taking the world back to a kind of rules-based system, and if the Chinese ultimately decide to go along with what's in their interest, that's one thing. But if we're getting into a situation where the Chinese and others are not going to play by the rules, then we are going to be pulled willy-nilly into a closer relationship with the United States than we have been.
Yeah. And so I guess, we could dig into this. There's so many other aspects we could go over, but to wrap it up, I'm hoping you can kind of leave us off with a big takeaway. Obviously, battle lines are being drawn. Things are getting harder, I think. What is the path forward for Canada in how we advance and go forward in our relationship, trying to negotiate, communicate, or even coexist with China at this point?
I think we need to get back to a government situation where expertise matters. We have to be making decisions that are well founded and sensible. That's and not sort of operate on autopilot. But for Canada itself, I think the big takeaway is that the world is changing. It's not necessarily going to be in a way that is fundamentally injurious to our interests. But there's no guarantee on that, and we're going to need to have a lot more effort put into diplomacy and relations with other countries than we've done so far.
Right, and so I'm assuming Dominic Barton will have to head back there sooner rather than later. But thank you so much, Paul, for joining us.